The Uyghurs are the people who live in the Tarim Basin, round the Great Taklamakan Desert, in all those oasis towns, and they've been there for thousands of years. Their ancestry is difficult to describe. Some of them come from the Caucasus, some of them from northwest, what is now northwest frontier area. The name Uyghur is relatively recent in the sense that it was applied to these people, the sedentary farming people of the oases. It was applied to them in the 1920s, I think, first. It's taken from a true Turkic tribal federation who had an empire, the Uyghur Empire, and they were Turkic peoples from the north of modern China, and steppe people, nomadic people, and they formed an empire which was very considerable at the time of the Tang dynasty, when there was also, by the way, a Tibetan empire. So you had quite a substantial Uyghur force in that region of what is now China. But the name, as I say, although the oasis people are Turkic, they speak a Turkic language, and they are Muslims in common with a lot of Central Asia who were Islamicized at about 13 or 1400 AD. The Uyghurs, even at first sight, it's obvious they're not Chinese. People talk about Han Chinese. Well, the Han Chinese are themselves a composite of lots of different peoples. But these people, the Uyghurs, are quite different. They're related to the Mongols, and some of them have a sort of Mongoloid characteristics, facial characteristics. But for the most part, and the further west you go in Xinjiang, where they live, the more aquiline, dark, bearded, slim, tall, quite different, in other words, from the standard Chinese type. They're not, at the same time, when I say they're Muslims, but they're not like the other Muslims of China who are more Chinese in origin, but who became Islamicized. They live mostly nowadays in Ningxia province, which is on the Yellow River to the east of Xinjiang, and there are Hui people all over the place, but that's their cultural center. And the two variants of Chinese Muslim, one ethnically Chinese, the other not, don't really see eye to eye either. They disagree quite violently. My impression, and I think most people would agree with this, that Islam in Xinjiang, among the Uyghurs, is much more cultural than it is devotional. They're not strict, although there are, in Kashgar you will see women wearing the full veil, the brown veil, covering the whole head. But that's the only place you'll see it. For the most part, they're pretty lackadaisical. The men like to drink, and at the same time, it's true that nowadays, I think possibly more are going to the mosque than used to do, and that may have something to do with the fact that the Han Chinese are watching them so closely. I see attendance at the big Friday mosque prayers, attendance as a sign of, as a kind of cultural marker. People are trying to differentiate themselves. That's not to say that there aren't religious devotees, enthusiasts as well, but as I say, I think people go to the mosque partly to make a point, rather as Roman Catholics in Poland used to go to church during the communist government. The imams are closely controlled, as the Orthodox priesthood was in Soviet Russia. So go to the mosque, you're not alone with Allah. There will be sometimes cameras. The imam himself will have been vetted. He will be required to make patriotic sermons about the cooperation with the Chinese and with the authorities and so on. So mosque attendance, as I say, is not a refuge from everyday life. It's, as I say, I think, something of a statement of identity.
OK， 打得好，太棒了，好枪法，好枪手。
Since the so-called war on terrorism, since 9/11 and the rest of it, the Chinese government has stamped the Uyghurs with this, they've tarred them with this brush of terrorism, almost without differentiation. So there may be, as I say, some zealots, there may be some influence from across the border, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, from Kazakhstan. But I think it's right to say that Islam for most Uyghurs is a cultural thing. It's a way of life. It's their ancestry. It's what they do. It's how they are, like the other peoples of Central Asia. I don't believe that it's the reason for trouble in that region. I think the reason for their dislike of the Han Chinese is much easier to find. It's that they're not treated like citizens of China. They're treated as second-class citizens, and racial discrimination and in all walks of life is the main reason for their anger, and the main reason for with those who wish to have an independent state. But again, I don't think most Uyghurs regard an independent East Turkestan as a viable option. I think they'd be content just to be treated properly. It's a very conservative society, and women occupy that domestic, subservient role. In Uyghur homes, you will see that women, they get up and start chopping the vegetables first thing in the morning and cleaning up and sweeping up. But that's the first impression. Lots of Uyghur girls go to work and in the shops and in the hospitals, and there are plenty of girls who go out to earn. But the attitude of Uyghur men, I should say, is pretty old-fashioned, and I think they like to keep up the appearance that they're in charge and that the women do what they're told. Uyghur men are extremely defensive of their women, and it should also be said that Uyghur girls are very attractive to Chinese men. In fact, they're attractive to any man. They're good-looking, a lot of them are very good-looking girls. This can cause quite serious problems, and it means, for example, that you don't often find the Han Chinese and the Uyghurs in the same nightclub or dancing in the same nightclub, because it usually ends in a fight. I have seen them happily eating in these kind of nightclubs where they do kind of formal Uyghur dancing and all that kind of thing. And you do sometimes see parties of Chinese in there. But if a Han Chinese tries to dance with a Uyghur girl, then I think it would cause trouble. And the Han Chinese, by and large, keep away because they're quite frightened. And this is one of the many tensions in Xinjiang is the fear of that the Han Chinese immigrants have of the native population, and they're aware of the hatred that many of the Uyghurs feel for them. What the Chinese Communist Party did was to follow the example set by Lenin and the Soviet Union, which was to categorize the different minority nationalities, as they call them, and give them names and define them in a kind of way that they were never defined before. So going back to the other point, Uyghurs became defined in a way which they'd never known before. And incidentally, it's worth saying that some people think that the identification of these oasis farmers as Uyghurs has given them a sense of national unity which they never had before. And it's certainly true that if you ask a Uyghur what he is, he says, "Oh, I'm a Kashgarlik. I'm from Kashgar or Turfanlik or Khotanlik." He will give his oasis town name and he won't say, "I'm a Uyghur." The model of the Soviet Union was that you created ethnic areas which had so-called autonomous or semi-independent status. But in practice, they never had the real possibility to secede from, in the case of the Soviet Union, they couldn't secede from the Soviet Union, although it looked they were all border areas, and it looked as though they theoretically could, but they couldn't secede. And the control of these, the governmental control, was provided, although you had a governor and officials all the way down the line in administration, in the factories, in the farms, and so on. The actual control is exercised by the Communist Party. So the provincial party secretary is the boss. Communist Party secretary is the boss in Urumqi, and all the way down the line, the local nationality cadres or officials are shadowed by a Communist Party member who actually has the control. One further point about Xinjiang is that because there are so many different ethnic nationalities, Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and Mongols and Uyghurs and even a few Tajiks, Uzbeks even, the whole underneath the autonomous, inside the autonomous region as a whole, there are lots of constituencies. And so there's the Mongol region, and there's the Kazakh region, and there's the Kyrgyz region. These are autonomous regions within the province. But if you look at them, you'll find that the Kazakh region is not dominated by the Kazakhs. The Mongol region is not dominated by Mongols. In other words, there's a kind of gerrymandering of the constituencies, so that no ethnic minority has anywhere control over its own people, if that's clear. The area in which most of the Uyghurs live, or traditionally came from, which is round the Taklamakan Desert, is actually called the Mongol region. But there aren't very many Mongols there. So, and the whole area is called the Uyghur Autonomous Region, but it has no, as I say, there is no power to go with that name. The reason it remains, this system, is simply because nobody's thought of changing it. And it was set up originally because Mao Zedong, rather like Lenin, had, before taking power, had promised the minority nationalities, as they're called, that they would have independence under socialism. When he got into power in 1949, he went back on that, and that's been attested. There's actually evidence for that reversal of policy. So they were promised freedom, and but still the government went ahead with this kind of system that looked as though it would deliver some form of autonomy. But very quickly it became clear that the Mao Zedong was not going to give anybody autonomy, especially because in this region of China, which is strategically very sensitive, first because of the Soviet Union, and when China and the Soviet Union fell out in the late 50s, it became a very dodgy area for the Chinese. And now it's dodgy again, even though the Soviet Union has gone, because it's surrounded by independent Central Asian states, some of whom contain militant jihadi Muslims. When the Communist Party took control of the far west, they were welcomed by a lot of the Uyghurs because the nationalists had treated the Uyghurs quite badly. And so it was seen as a great relief, and the Brotherhood of Man was in evidence, and large numbers of Chinese came in, young people and professional people, technical people, came into Xinjiang to help build socialism in the province, and they were welcomed. It wasn't... then, of course, when the dismantling of Uyghur society began, the collectivization, and of the Kazakhs and the other people, when the dismantling of society began, and the people realized what was happening, of course, the mood became sour. And things were made, this was up to the sort of time of the Cultural Revolution, when the minority people suffered really very severely because of their geographical position, because they were not trusted, because of their proximity to Central Asia. After the Cultural Revolution, the expropriation which the local people had suffered and the harassment was made even worse by an enormous influx of Han Chinese. First of all, they were settled deliberately in large numbers. It's something that the Chinese, the emperors had wanted to do, considered doing 200 or 300 years before, but had never succeeded in doing. Now it was done for real, and huge numbers were brought in. After the collapse of the elimination of the internal movements, controls over the internal movement of population, lots of migrants came in, voluntary migrants came in as well, and in the last decade, they were coming in at such a rate that today there are probably more Han Chinese in Xinjiang than there are. They're probably the majority in the province. National census figures suggest that the Uyghurs are the largest group, that the Han Chinese are the next, and then the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and Mongols and so on. But if you add in all the army, People's Liberation Army, paramilitary police, advisors, specialists, the Bingtuan Xinjiang Production and Construction Corporation, then there's probably a majority of Han Chinese. And I think the Uyghurs would number about 8 million. It might be more than that, it might be 10 million, but I don't think anybody's ever done a proper survey. And the official census can't quite be trusted because it leaves out 1 million or 2 Han Chinese. I mean, the point I'm making about the Bingtuan, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corporation, I think it's now called, which has got about 1 million people, all Han Chinese. They're a state within a state. I mean, they run a kind of whole system, manufacturing, judicial, agricultural. It's within Xinjiang, which doesn't report to Urumqi at all, to the provincial government. It reports directly to Beijing. So they don't count as residents. One would have to say that relations between the two peoples is not good. As I say, there's dislike on one side and fear on the other side. Of course, there are some middle-class professional Uyghur families who have accommodated to the new world. There are people Uyghurs I've known who have very cheerfully signed up for new flats in the high-rise blocks that have been built in Kashgar and other towns, and they like the idea of hot and cold running water and electricity and all the rest of it. There are people who work with the system. There are Uyghurs in all levels of society who work with the system. But I have to say that they are pretty unpopular with the majority. That the Uyghurs in general, the middle class is probably, as I say, accommodate. But and out in the country where the peasant farmers are, who are all Uyghur, they have no choice but to accommodate. They carry on as peasant farmers will anywhere in the world. They kind of ignore what's going on above them and just get on with life. The real problem comes with the urbanization, people coming into the cities, and the young Uyghurs who find that they are not employed, they're not given jobs. There are large numbers of young unemployed, and there are problems with drink and drugs and prostitution, and it's at this level of society where the big problems are building up. And it's at this level that the Chinese really are, one has to say, creating a rod for their own backs. The thing that they fear most, fanaticism, whether it's religious or nationalist or separatist, whatever you want to call it, extremism is precisely what's going to happen if they don't solve the social problem, which they have created. And they've created the social problem by giving preference. From what I learned in my travels there, always giving preference to Han Chinese. So whether it's a matter of promotion inside a company or whether it's a new job in a company, the Han Chinese will always get preference. Even on the building sites, for the great economic development program that's going on, and this enormous building program which has been going on, even on building sites, the Han authorities will bring in contract labour from inner China, Gansu or Sichuan or some other province like that. Huge numbers of labourers are brought in to do the work, while the Uyghurs stand beside, just unemployed, staring at it. And I was quite struck in the place I stayed in the edge of Kashgar, Uyghur area, to see some Uyghur boys with a van used to come every night to the huge building site which had been cleared on the edge of the town to put up new flats. They used to come at night and steal bits of blocks of breeze blocks and sand and whatever they could lay their hands on, drive away with it. But in the daytime there wasn't a single Uyghur visible on that building site. And this is the kind of thing which, avoidable kinds of things, which the Chinese authorities just don't seem to understand. Or if they do understand, it only means that they are deliberately marginalising these people, the Uyghur people, who are Chinese citizens. Even if they don't feel themselves to be, they are Chinese citizens. The human rights situation is, well, I think we have to look at it in two levels really, because there are basic citizens' rights which we in the West would say Chinese don't even have. No Chinese have basic citizens' rights. When it comes to the law, for example, you can be sent without trial by a purely administrative decision. You can be sent down to, used to be 4 years I think, but maybe 2 years for re-education through labour. And that's at the whim of a committee which just takes you away. And this is throughout China. So you can't say what you want. You can't write what you want. You can't read what you want. One understands that in developing countries. Obviously, it's normal for people to go through countries to go through this kind of when they're coming from one system, as it were, into another. Restrictions are bound to occur. That no Chinese have what we would call basic citizens' rights, habeas corpus being the most obvious. Freedom of expression, the right to speak and to read and to hear and to see, they don't have. The reason I think it's worth saying, the reason I think for this is that Chinese traditionally are more interested in what's going on in your head than in what you do. So it's thought management. It's a system which depends, the judicial system is all about changing the way you think about yourself and about the state and about the Communist Party. That's the tradition. It probably goes right back into imperial times. In fact, it does go back into imperial times. It's this worrying about how people think that is so peculiar and damaging. In the West, we, of course, we're interested in motive, but we punish people for what they do, not for what they think. Occasionally you can be punished for what you say if it's very inflammatory. But in China, any criticism of the state, even talking about so-called state secrets, which might be unemployment figures or something that you've read telling foreigners about the unemployment statistics, is seen as a kind of treason. It's what you think about the state that they're obsessed about. And that's why the penal system is so, to our way of thinking, so severe. They call it reform and correction, but it's really an attempt to break people's spirit and to make them think in a completely different way, become different people. The second level, of course, is the minorities, and people like the Uyghurs, or any minorities in China, the Mongols, who were punished terribly during the Cultural Revolution, is that they are particularly disadvantaged because not only do they suffer, as every Chinese does, from a lack of basic rights, they often have this extra discrimination against them. Now, there is some positive discrimination in education, places at university, this kind of thing. But they don't really compensate for the most egregious treatment, which is that if you look at the jails of, according to Amnesty International anyway, the jails of Xinjiang are full of Uyghurs. There are very few Han Chinese inside those jails. There are many cases reported where, in a dispute between a Han Chinese and a Uyghur, the Han Chinese will get off and the Uyghur will never get off. There's the campaigns against the campaigns about population planning, family planning, where officials go into Uyghur farms and villages and seek out the women and for sterilization or forcible abortion. And although the allocation of children is more generous for minority peoples than it is for Han Chinese, the actual enforcement of the policy is much, much more severe, apparently, on the Uyghurs than it is on the Han Chinese. The sinification or sinicization of Xinjiang is quite apparent, and you go to any town of any size and you'll see that there's a Chinese built centre with with Chinese offices and houses and flats and so on. And the old Uyghur centre is been left to one side, so you've got almost like, in many places, two cities where there was only one before. And the physical changes in Xinjiang are colossal. Urumqi itself, which is never, by the way, not really a Uyghur city at all, it's up in the northern half of the province, and Manchu Foundation. I mean, a few years ago, well, only 50 years ago, it was described as a place where camels would drown in the streets. And when I first went to Urumqi, it was still a low-rise 1930s sort of city, with one or two high-rises had gone up. I think there was a Four Seasons hotel with a restaurant on the top and that kind of thing, but not much. And then 10 years later, within 10 years, it was a forest of skyscrapers. The skyline completely altered. Very remarkable. Whether all these buildings are productive is another question, of course. But the physical transformation of Xinjiang is quite extraordinary, and the government is trying to make the West as economically progressive as the Eastern Seaboard. It's a deliberate policy to try and even up the two sides, the interior, the poor interior, with the much richer coastal part of China. The problem, of course, is that this development in the far west, which looks good, as I say, it's not quite clear how profitable it is, how sensible it is even, but the physical development of the West, the economic development of the West, is not going into the pockets of the native people. The very people who are supposed to be benefiting from it are not. And the people who are benefiting from it mostly are the incomers, the Han Chinese immigrants. To try and explain what's happening in Xinjiang, I've often said it's like Tibet, except it looks differently, and the religion is not Buddhism but Islam. It is in other ways they're very similar, because policy towards both minority groups is the same. Even the history is a bit similar. But I think the reason is because, well, there are a number of reasons. The first, the obvious one, is that the Dalai Lama is a sort of hero, saint figure, that charms everybody, and has done tremendous PR for his people. And the Uyghurs haven't had anybody like that, and indeed they're notoriously bad at agreeing with each other. This goes back to the old inter-Oasis rivalry, I suspect. But they're very bad at getting on with each other. They do now have a charismatic leader in America, who's the president of their exile council body, Rebia Kadir, who is a very successful businesswoman. But she's not known. She's not really known to us in the West generally, whereas the Dalai Lama is famous. The other reason is that there are other reasons. One is, I suppose, that Britain has a historical interest in Tibet, since from our Raj in India, made some rather unfortunate excursions, trade missions, I think, young husbands trade in the early 1900s. So we have a kind of historical interest via India. Another reason is that the Tibetans are Buddhists, and Buddhist to us means pacifist. Saffron-robed monks going quietly about their business, and prayer wheels and all that sort of thing. And of course the Western infatuation with Eastern religion and Zen Buddhism and so on, starting in the 60s and going strong today, means that there's a kind of sympathy with Tibetan Lamaism, and therefore with the place and the monks, the monasteries. So the cultural assault on Tibet has been very, very well documented, and I think there's a high level of emotional commitment amongst people to the Tibetans. I think and of course, the fact that the Uyghurs and the most of the other Central Asian peoples in Xinjiang province are Muslim is not helping them at a time when everyone is jumpy about Islam. So there's a very obvious kind of reason why it shouldn't be. But that, after all, is quite new, and I don't think probably is a very good reason for why Xinjiang is ignored. I think the reason more likely is that the place has been closed effectively since the late 1930s. There were a lot of Western travellers and writers who went to Eastern Turkistan, as it was, or Chinese Turkistan, as it was called, in the early half of the 20th century, first sort of third of the 20th century. Lots of books, travellers' books and adventure stories and things came out of there. It was an area of great fascination. It closed down underneath the sort of rogue mandarins who took over German nationalists after the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911. There was a series of rogue mandarins who ran the place as private fiefdom. Eventually they closed it down. And of course, under communism, it was a closed area because of the strategic frontier. But now, of course, that the Silk Road has become a big travel destination. A lot of people are going to that part of China. Xinjiang was opened to foreign tourism, I think, in the late 80s. A lot of people are going there, and even if they don't understand the complexity of the situation, and it is complex, they at least are beginning to get to know what Uyghurs are, and to recognise the importance, historical importance and interest of places like Kashgar. So I think the climate's changed, and I think more people will be interested in the fate of the people who native to that place than were, say, even 5 years ago, when one could hardly find anybody who knew what a Uyghur was.